Matt Locke is one of the directors of Storythings, a company that spends a lot of time thinking about audiences, attention, and how B2B brands can stay human. I first came across them when director Hugh Gary shared something on LinkedIn called How to Avoid Generic Thought Leadership Disease. And one of their suggestions was to look for what they call sector symptoms, the subjects, language, and cliches that keep showing up across everybody's content in a particular industry. And I've seen that firsthand. I've worked with companies who thought of the exact same industry topics and wrote them the way everyone else does in their space. And it's because they're easy ideas, and a lot of times it's more about content production instead of audience value and industry differentiation. It's like nobody stops to ask, has our audience already seen or heard this from 15 other companies? And if they have, what are we actually adding to the conversation? Now, when I talked with Matt, Storythings was in the middle of a series exploring this problem. So I asked Matt why he thinks so many of us keep falling into this trap.
So first of all, I'll put my hand up because I've been writing this series on what we call B2B zombification for it's a 7-week series and I'm kind of 5 weeks into it. And as I'm writing every single one, I'm realizing that I've made the same mistakes. So I just want to kind of say that none of the stuff that we're writing is coming from a place of kind of harsh criticism. It's just recognizing stuff that we all do. And particularly in B2B comms, I think one of the biggest challenges that people have when they're writing B2B comms is they kind of think that there's a separate mode of attention that we go into when we're in a work context. So maybe we're kind of trying to find information for an upcoming project, or maybe we're kind of looking at information for a new strategy or starting a buying process. I think we all assume that there is a special mode of attention that means that we don't have to be interesting and what people want are just boring, dry facts. And that's just really not the case. And that's really what we're trying to get at with our series, Stay Human.
Now, I think this is a really good place to start because before we even get into some of the obvious symptoms of generic content, there's a self-awareness issue underneath all of this. When we get into that work frame of mind, marketing frame of mind, content frame of mind, whatever you want to call it, that is really what causes us to create content that's boring, uninteresting, or even in this case, not very human. But it also tends to be repetitive because our competitors are in that frame of mind too, because they think that's the way they're supposed to create content. That's the way it's supposed to sound. Now the zombie thing really is spreading, right? Everybody starts sounding like everybody else because everybody thinks to some degree this is what business content is supposed to sound like. We can't afford to have that happen when attention is so critical today. That's what we're competing for, and that's also what Matt is obsessed with.
My own background is at BBC and Channel 4, two of the public broadcasters at the UK. And I've been working in digital for about the last 25, 30 years. And the one thing I'm really, really geeky and obsessed about is attention and audience attention and how we make decisions as audiences. And the big thing that's changed in particularly the last 15 years or so since the start of the smartphone is we've become the schedulers of our own attention. So it used to be that gatekeepers, TV schedulers, magazine editors, newspaper editors, they used to organize our attention for us. They would decide what we could see every day and how much of it we could see. And first of all, with the internet, and then particularly with smartphones, we now have access to as much stuff as you could possibly want to see at any point of the day, whether that's reports from something to do with your work, whether that's a trailer for a new Netflix series, whether that's a podcast you're listening to, whether it's a Slack message from one of your colleagues, we're just inundated with it. So the big challenge for us as storytellers is that your audience is constantly making decisions about what do I give my attention to.
It really amazes me that this concept is still an issue these days, because back in the days of TV and radio, or what Brafton called the marketing era, brands could just send out one-way communications in the form of commercials and ads because the audiences were captive. But the internet and social media changed that and took that control away from us and put the power of choice and attention to the audience. But brands still create and publish content like they're in control. And when Matt was at the BBC, he said they weren't curious about audience. They were focused on ratings. And he sees that behavior across industries. And maybe that means there's more of a focus on internal numbers versus the behaviors, interests, and trends of audience. Now that approach creates a problem with how we approach content But Matt says we can snap out of that.
And it's that lack of curiosity that leads you into those kind of more mundane behaviors. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, do I really understand my audience? Have I spoken to my audience? Am I doing this for them? Or am I doing this for my finance officer that needs to see a certain kind of performance metric go up? Or am I doing this for an algorithm on a platform? Or am I doing this because we've got a workflow that means that, everything has to be seen by 17 different people across the organization before it goes out? So who are you telling stories for? Are you really telling them for your audience? And do you really understand what audience wants? Or have you become divorced and separated from your audience? And are there now like 4 or 5 steps in the way between you and that connection? And if that's the case, then you really have to try and remake that connection with your audience again, and try speaking to them directly and getting that direct feedback back. Storytelling is all about call and response. It's all about saying the message. Even as we're talking now, we're looking at each other and we're kind of reading each other's body language about, how this conversation is going. That is true for all storytelling. The problem is, the reason why people got divorced from the audience at the BBC is radio and TV didn't have a feedback loop. The only feedback loop they had was what you call in American Nielsen ratings, what we call Barb over here. I remember vividly at Channel 4, the other public broadcaster, the first meeting I went to, where somebody said, people were talking about our show on Twitter last night. And I was like, hallelujah, finally, the voice of the audience is coming into this commissioning meeting. But other than that, they didn't have the voice of the audience. And that's the challenge, is that we can become too cut off from our audiences, too cut off by process, by budgets, by the need to impress internal stakeholders rather than really reach the audience. So you've got to try and find ways of getting rid of all that cruft and just reconnecting to the audience again.
Now, what Matt's describing also makes me think about something I've talked about before, which is how the way an organization communicates internally can affect the way it communicates externally. If you have a culture where most of the communication is one way, where leadership knows best, always decides what needs to be said, little room for new ideas, everybody executes the process, no feedback really involved, and then we look at the numbers repeated over and over again, it probably shouldn't surprise us when they approach content communication with audiences the same way. But even if you take a more modern two-way communication approach where you're thinking more about what's going to stand out and get the attention of your audience, you still may find yourself thinking, well, what does different look like in my industry? For example, can talking to customers create stories to tell? Well, Matt says yes.
I mean, the deep irony of a lot of thought leadership is that there's not any new thoughts in it, and there's no leadership because you're just quoting the same reports as everyone else. And so one of our biggest clients is ADP. Global payroll leaders across the world. I think 1 in 7 paychecks in the US is paid through ADP. They're absolute giants. And they brought us in because they believe that payroll is like the most human connection between companies and their employees. If you don't get the paycheck right, people are going to get angry pretty quickly. But also there are so many stories behind paychecks. So we ran this quarterly for them for a while called Rethink, that's tied to their annual event. And we wanted to tell the human stories. We didn't just want to do all of the usual reports about, the world of work that you get from all those big industries. So we looked outside of that sector. And one of the things we found that was really interesting about pay is that actually a lot of employees, particularly migrant workers, send money back to their home economies. It's called remittances. You might move from Mexico to work in the US, or you might move from sub-Saharan Africa to kind of France or Germany or the UK, and you might send money back to your home country, to your family. And we found out from World Bank statistics that something like 4 to 5 times as much money goes into emerging economies from remittances, from people paying back their wages to their families, than all global aid put together. So there's this remarkable story about this money traversing the planet from employees to their families. That is absolutely, there are some countries where remittances is like 30 or 40% of the entire GDP of the country. So there's this incredible amount of data about all of this money coming back. Now, if you're running payroll, you can make a really big difference to your employees, because a lot of these remittances have to use very, very expensive transfer systems like Western Union and stuff, because people are unbanked or because they can't kind of send foreign payments using their banks and stuff like that. So you could actually help your employees with that. So we just looked outside of that bubble of the payroll sector to look at something slightly different. In that case, World Bank, I mean, we're talking about really serious statistics here. This wasn't a kind of, dodgy internet site, but just taking statistics and stories from another sector and bringing it back into theirs made a really, really big difference to that story. And it was a story that we weren't seeing any of their competitors telling.
I love this example because since we're talking about thought leadership that starts to sound generic, I think about the times when I hear an expert create thought leadership content that says, tell stories when developing your content. And that's it. No framework, guide, examples. He just, if you want to stand out, tell stories. Thank you and good night. And you might be sitting there going, okay, well, how? And by the way, that's a good question. And Matt has some answers. He says the first thing is to understand the difference between storytelling and story finding.
Always start a story with a question that you don't know the answer to. The problem with a lot of thought leadership is that it's kind of handed down to you. Like, here's an issue, here's something that we're doing, here's a kind of thing that the company believes in. We just need to get it out there. And so you're starting from a perspective where you know what you want to say and you're just repeating it. You're like a teacher reading from a book. And it's very hard to tell a compelling story. All compelling stories have a kind of momentum to them. They have a quest that kind of drives it, a search for knowledge in some way. So even within a framework like that, if you've been handed something down from your bosses saying, we need to tell a story about this, just spend a little bit of time thinking, what do I not understand about that? What's the thing that's confusing for me about this? Because if you can start your story with a question, your audience are going to enjoy the journey that you go on as a writer. And so, my English teacher used to say to me, if you found something boring to write, it's 100 times more boring to read. And I think that's really true. So if you go on a little journey and a quest, then actually people are going to go on that journey with you and they're going to find the story way more interesting. So that's our first tip, is start exploring that subject with a question. So we did that with that remittances story. Somebody mentioned remittances in a meeting with ADP. And we were like, what are these? We don't really know what they are. And then we went and found all this World Bank data, and suddenly we had a whole story unfolding in front of us. So always start with something you don't know the answer to. The second one is find your unusual experts. Most of the voices that you can speak to for a story are going to be C-suite level people in your business. They all want their voices in the story. They want to be the ones that are kind of featured in the think pieces in Financial Times or whatever. But sometimes the people who have got the most compelling angle on an issue are the people who are really at the coalface, who are really kind of like thinking about it.
I've seen this as an issue that people run into when they're working on a podcast or maybe a video interview or a blog series that involves talking to other people or guests. And it turns into a trap that we can fall into because we're not leading with the right motivations sometimes. As a podcast, for example, one of the reasons people like having big name guests on their show is because it makes their show look good, right? Or it makes it look credible. But to Matt's point, the audience may not care as much because they may hear that guest all the time, or they've heard plenty of interviews with them. And that's why it helps to be a good interviewer. If you're going to do this, you have to prep in a way that helps you ask unique questions that increase the chances your audience gets to hear that guest say something they haven't said before. And by the way, the guest likes that too. But there's also real value in finding unique voices or really insightful people that don't get a chance to be on a podcast or get featured on content in any way. And you're giving them a spotlight and you're giving your audience something different. It really is about thinking a little deeper about your audience and recognizing what keeps your content from standing out and resonating with them.
There are probably a number of formats that you have to do every year. There might be annual reports, there might be quarterly reports, there might be kind of newsletters you send out once a month. There might be stuff in internal communications that you kind of have to do. And the sheer relentless cadence of those formats means that you just end up telling the same stories time and time and time again. And that absolutely is why you should just step back and just maybe pick the last 3 versions or the last, if you've been running a particular content format for a number of years, just pick 3 or 4 versions of it over the last couple of years and just look at what's the same. Like, what are you always saying? What doesn't change? And then think, why are we retelling that story in the same way every time? What new angles can we get on it? How can we tell that differently? Can we kind of like make that an evergreen piece of content that sits somewhere else so we don't have to retell? Like, what are the things we can do to kind of break out of those really tight, let's do the same thing we did last year kind of patterns that a lot of marketers fall into, particularly in B2B. I think that's really, really common in B2B because we tend to think of the work that we do as being tied into these business cycles and these kind of annual cycles of the companies we work for. And it's really tricky to break out of that. But yeah, you have to be aware of your own cliches and your own kind of patterns as well.
Yeah, it can be all too easy to get caught up in internal processes and dehumanize our audiences by labeling them something or tying them to nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Getting consumed in all that could mean that our business goals and human behaviors just really aren't aligned.
You kind of assume that you're really like, oh, we're trying to reach our buyers, and those buyers are these companies. But they're not. They're just humans. They're people like me and you sitting at their laptops, maybe worrying about something they're going to do this weekend or looking forward to something they're going to do this weekend and thinking about their mortgage and thinking about all those things. And yeah, you have to connect with them at a human level. And I think that's one of the biggest problems, is that we kind of forget that our buyers, I think there's two things that we forget. One is we forget that our buyers are humans. And the second thing is in B2B, because a lot of it is measured according to attribution metrics, how did this lead to a sale? And the last kind of 10, 15 years, the shift has really been towards, down the bottom of the funnel towards performance marketing, which is kind of insane. That makes a lot of sense in B2C, where somebody's making an instinctive decision about whether to buy a pair of Levi's or an Uggs boots or whether to drink Coke or Pepsi. It makes absolutely no sense to focus on performance marketing, where you're dealing with a software decision every 5 years that might be 10 to 20 million pounds. That's not the kind of decision. Somebody doesn't get a LinkedIn ad and suddenly switch their behavior around a buying decision that they might have spent 6 months working on. So the really interesting thing about B2B buying, and there's some brilliant research from Jan Schwartz at the LinkedIn B2B Institute about this, is that most business buying groups, so buying groups for a starter who you're trying to reach, or you're reaching a group of people who are going to have conversations with each other to agree on both a shortlist and then a final buyer. So that's humans having conversations. They have to tell each other stories about why they think buyer A is better than buyer B. If you haven't landed those stories with them in advance, you're not even going to be on the list. There's some great research that shows that 81% from this LinkedIn Jan Schwartz research, 81% of buyers already know the brands or the suppliers that they're going to have on their shortlist before they issue RFPs. So if you've got a performance campaign that's trying to reach people when they make a decision, you're just not going to affect that decision. They've already made a decision based on what they know about you as a company that's probably been built up over years by your brand. And if you're not front of mind, it's the old kind of, Byron Sharp, how brands grow stuff again. If you're not front of mind when they're starting to make that buying journey process, then you're not going to be at the end to win it. You can't kind of come in at the end of that process as a completely unknown entity. Something like only 4% of brands, basically, who are unknown to most of the buyer group, ended up winning the work. So if you're not building your brand, if you're not positioning your stories, if you're not creating mindshare in your target audience through really engaging content that speaks to the values of your brand, not just your products, but what you stand for and why you're interesting. If you're not interesting enough to be getting attention from your buyers, sometimes months or years before they make a buying decision, then you're just not even going to be in the starting gate. So the idea that you can reach somebody with a highly targeted ad campaign that converts somebody at the point of buying is actually, for my money, that's completely ludicrous.
If audiences are going to be a meaningful part of your content strategy, you also have to know where they are and where they consume content. It's not uncommon for this to be overlooked in the social media strategy today. In the early days of social, brands thought they had to be everywhere. Now it's just smart to simply know which platforms they're on. Otherwise, you're really just wasting your time and the audience's time.
We never let clients say to us, what's our TikTok or what's our LinkedIn strategy? We always say, what's your audience strategy? Like, who are you trying to reach? What are their needs? And the other thing we talk about a lot is how are you going to create value for them? There's no shortage of things for people to give their attention to. So how do you change the way that people engage with your content from something that they just see as they're driving by their streams to something that they actively seek out because it's valuable? Because if you create valuable content, then not only are they going to subscribe to it, build a relationship with you around the value that you're creating for them, but they're more likely to recommend you so they can create value with their peers in your organization. So you're going to get that kind of organic sharing rather than the kind of algorithmic sharing that a lot of people focus on platforms. So one of the things that we do with our clients is we use the value proposition framework, but we do it for content, not business propositions. So we say, what is the value? What are the needs? What are the jobs to be done for your target audience? What are they trying to do? What are they trying to solve? What are their pains? What are their gains? And then how can your content meet some of those? So we work backwards from the user's jobs to be done and then work out what content the organization can create rather than going from inside the organization out. And broadly, we kind of say that there are three things. If you want to be very, very schematic as a way of starting to think about this, there are three types of value you can create for your audience with content. You can create, so you can tell new stories that they can't get from anyone else, not generic thought leadership that just looks like the same, reports about the same Gartner reports and stuff like that. So what are the stories that only you can tell? So you can create new stuff. You can curate, and that's really valuable. So curating kind of news and reports, curating interesting links, making it easy for your audience to access a lot of information about their sector in a way that's very useful to them. Curation is a very, very valuable thing that you can do. Most of us subscribe to newsletters that curate information about our industry for us because it's hugely useful and valuable. And you can convene. You can bring people together to share perspectives and get different angles on an issue in your sector in ways that maybe only you can bring together as your company. Maybe your company has a particular kind of reach. Maybe you're multinational. You can get people from different regions of the world to discuss the same issues from different perspectives.
So, if you're now really focused on trying to have some of this self-awareness and recognize habits that might be sabotaging your content, you're thinking more about audience and staying human, and this is something that you want to apply in your organization, what's the first step?
Find your own problem that you want to solve. Don't try new things just for the sake of trying new things, but try and solve a problem with it. So, have you seen a downturn in engagement on a particular form of your comms? Is there a new audience that you're trying to reach? Are you trying to reposition part of your company? Try and identify that problem and use that as an opportunity to try and test some of what we're doing. Our work with ADP started because they do an annual event called Rethink, where they get, a few hundred of their lead clients from all over the world together in one place to hear some brilliant presentations and to hear from each other. And in 2020, of course, they couldn't do that because of COVID. So they needed to come up with new formats and ways of reaching the audience. And that's when they came to us. And that's when we started working with ADP. And we're now 5 years down the line, and we help them with their event, and we do monthly podcasts and all sorts of content for them. But the opportunity came because they couldn't do the thing that they normally did, which was this big annual event. So find those opportunities, either because there's a problem or because there's an opportunity to do something new, and try that. The other thing that we always say, the big difference between the media world, where I was for years at the BBC and Channel 4, and the world of marketing and B2B comms in particular, is a simple thing, and that's a pilot. Like, we never commissioned anything from any company without making a test first and just seeing what it worked. Did it work or not? Because if you're going to make something new, you often need to make it a couple of times. Like when you try a new recipe, you need to make it a couple of times before it gets good. The problem is that people try something new. The first version they commission, they throw out to everyone. And if it doesn't work, they're like, oh, well, that didn't work. We'll try something else. So the secret to being really, really good at innovating with your comms is to not publish everything. Make cheap, quick versions, paper prototype them, find ways of testing it. When we do workshops on new formats for clients, we always end by saying, can you make a version of this for less than $10 in under an hour? It might be that if it's a podcast, you just record somebody in the office rather than hiring a studio. You use your phone, or if it's a written thing, you phone someone up and interview them and then get a translation app to transcribe it and edit the transcription. But we challenge you to make a version of a format for less than $10 in less than an hour. And you can do pretty much, with modern phones, you can do video formats for less than $10 in an hour. So it's almost impossible for you to not be able to make a version of a new format, no matter how kind of lo-fi it is, to just test the structure and to test the idea as quickly as you can, because most innovation stops when people come up with a new idea for a new content format and then realize that they're going to have to go and get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of pounds to try it. It's going to be a production process that takes 6 months. And by then, the whole thing has got so important that if it fails on the first one, you'll never get to do it again. So start small, pilot, build a few prototypes, test them with your internal audiences. Don't publish them. Don't put them out into the world yet. Do a few tests internally, kind of see how it's working, get feedback from people, show it to your friends and family, see what they think, and just use that prototyping phase that we absolutely relied on in the media industry. Use that prototyping phase to basically test the format before you go public.
A lot of generic content doesn't happen because people aren't creative enough. It happens because organizations get locked into familiar subjects, voices, formats, familiar ways of measuring whether it all worked or any of it worked. Getting out of that doesn't necessarily even mean you blow everything up. Sometimes it just starts with asking a different question, finding somebody your audience hasn't already heard from, trying a format before turning it into a 6-month production, or just stopping long enough to ask whether the content you're about to create is actually going to stand out and provide something of real value to your audience. After all, that's what they're looking for. Now, Matt and the team at Storythings help organizations around the world better understand their audiences, find and develop stronger stories, and create and test content formats that people might actually want to spend time with.